Hi, I'm Jessie and I'm a content specialist at Sepio, and this is a series of interviews with industry experts. And today we're talking to Kathy Casey. Hi, Kathy. Can you please tell me about yourself and your career?
Hi, Jessie. A pleasure to talk with you today. So my background is largely in law and public policy. Over the course of the past 20 plus years, I have worked in varying capacities. Much of my early career, was in the US government. I worked in the US Senate for about 13 years. So after graduating from law school, I found the opportunity to work in the office of a US Senator and worked in a variety of roles across a variety of different issues. Although I would say much of my career working for that senator ultimately was in the financial services area. On and off I worked on and off the US Senate Banking Committee. So I spent 13 years in the Senate, and I ended up finishing my career in the Senate as the staff director of the Senate Banking Committee. And I worked in that role for about 2.5 years, I believe. And then I was appointed to the US Securities and Exchange Commission in 2006 for a 5-year appointment. And as a commissioner with the US Securities and Exchange Commission, we're charged with the administration of the US securities laws, which oversee our capital markets. And so I served in that role for 5 years, and I ended up serving in that role during the financial crisis. So a fair amount of my focus during that time was also dictated by responding to the crisis. And much of my work was not only dealing with, I would say, the kind of initial market responses that the Commission was trying to manage through the crisis, but also in our regular efforts to enforce the securities laws. But I also was the representative to our many international organizations. So I was the representative to the Financial Stability Board, as well as to the International Organization of Securities Commissions. And that aspect of my work was actually very, very rewarding, because it gave me a view into what was happening happening globally with our colleagues in other parts of the world. And very valuable to see how regulation and concerns about emerging systemic risks were being addressed at a global level. So that was actually a very rewarding part of my service on the SEC, was being able to be engaged in those discussions and work streams during the financial crisis. When I left the SEC, since leaving the FCC in 2011, I have varying engagements. I'm affiliated with a financial regulatory advisory firm in Washington, D.C., where we focus on providing strategic regulatory advice to companies and other organizations. We also provide legal and compliance advice, as well as sort of third-party audits and things like that, which help companies ensure that they are complying with the law. And then in addition to that, I serve on several corporate and nonprofit boards, and have been doing that since about 2013, and have found that to be a very enriching experience, which has leveraged a lot of my work, certainly when I was at the SEC and focusing on issues of governance for the past 10 years. So that's sort of my background. Again, a lawyer by education and training, and with a very heavy focus on the regulatory and public policy area for most of my career. I would also kind of note, relevant to our discussion today, and early days when I had worked in the Senate, was there for the passage of the Gramm, Leach, Bliley Act, which is actually one of the sort of primary laws in the US which deal with the protection and sharing of highly sensitive financial information. So again, it's one of sort of the cornerstone laws that was passed back in 1999, and we actually played a very big role in influencing the adoption of that of those provisions.
Okay, and what are the general themes that you've seen in organizations' risk assessments?
So I would say, again, coming from a board level, I would say that, you know, it really does depend on the maturity of the organization, but, and you do see varying levels of maturity in risk assessment capabilities. But I would say that tremendous amount of focus and investment on increasing risk management and risk assessments. I think one of the key areas that you continue to see focus on is, I would say, access and controls. And the ability to have greater confidence around the kind of data and metrics you have around risk, cyber risk. But I would say for many organizations, part of it is trying to understand that, you know, ensuring that they have the right governance, and then I would say focusing on access and controls are some of the key areas that I see in risk assessments.
And have you seen organizations increase their awareness of hardware devices in their risk assessments?
So I would say not so much in the past, but increasingly. And I think this is really going to continue to be an area of increased focus as we have seen, you know, more remote working, right? So the pandemic has really, I think the pandemic is really going to drive more appreciation of the need to have greater visibility across, you know, an enterprise, and understanding the assets and devices that that you have across your enterprise. So I do think that as you look at probably a new normal where you're going to have an increasing amount of remote working, and you see how companies have tried to so quickly position themselves to be able to facilitate that, which I think has increased some of the risk and the confidence around their ability to manage those risks. I think that the hardware side is going to become an increasing focus and an area of increasing focus for companies as they look to harden that area.
And do you think that there are sufficient regulations in place to protect organizations from cyber attacks?
Well, so when you say protect organizations from cyber attack, I would say that there is no, and you think about the US, there's no sort of overarching law per se. It's sort of a patchwork. But I do think you see increasing focus and regulations being adopted both at the federal and state level. As I was mentioning earlier, if you go back in time to some of the earlier laws that sort of guided the collection and you know, use and sharing of information, you see that around certain sectors, whether it was the health sector, right, and health information, certain sensitive information on health information, financial information. That's with the Gramm, Leach, Bliley Act. So those were sort of, you know, early laws, I think, that really sort of recognized the kinds of risks that would be posed to how information, certain sensitive information, is collected, shared, and then again, potentially abused through breaches. And so you had certain regulations that were required to be adopted, certainly I would say by virtue of Gramm, Leach, Bliley, around making sure that you safeguard those rules, safeguard that information. So in addition to those two big sort of sector-specific laws, you also have the SEC, which has a broad remit with respect to how they oversee corporate disclosures. And I would say that in the past several years, the SEC has significantly stepped up its focus on cybersecurity, whether it's a focus on governance, whether it's a focus on risk management, whether it's a focus on data loss, whether it's a risk focus on the adequacy of disclosure, and along that, incidents response. So, you know, how are you responding? So I think that they have used their existing toolkit without any broader specific remit, to basically really drive greater risk management on cybersecurity. And you've seen that through a greater willingness to take enforcement actions as well. And one of the other aspects I would say that is an incentive for companies, that it's not specific to any particular regulation, but there's also the risk of litigation. So, being sued for particular breaches or loss of information. So that's, I think, another dynamic in the US that also provides some incentive for companies to try to ensure that they have adequate cybersecurity capabilities. So that's at sort of the federal level with respect to the two laws I mentioned and the role of the SEC. The Federal Trade Commission also has authority as well, dealing with particular breaches and whether or not there's adequate disclosure around breaches. But you also have state law. And I would say that the states have really been driving a lot of the advancement in cybersecurity protections and requirements. Certainly California has, as well as New York. California actually not only had a fairly rigorous privacy law, but also just recently has adopted sort of an Internet of Things, a device law that is intended to ensure security around the increasing use of IoT devices. And I think that that is also informing what you see in the US Congress. There's a bill that has passed the US House of Representatives that would similarly seek to address those kinds of the IoT devices from the federal government perspective, so government use of them. So I think that you're going to continue to see some of these states drive issues as well as at the federal level. The other thing I would note is when you think about in Europe, so other parts of the world, and that also have more comprehensive, perhaps more comprehensive laws that address requirements for cybersecurity and the consequences of not meeting those requirements. There's a dynamic that comes into play, certainly for large companies that operate globally, where they're going to ultimately seek to comply with the most stringent law. So I think that's something else that you'll continue to see, or companies will be in a position that regardless of whether or not you have a particular law in the US that might deal with them, if they're subject to the GDPR in Europe, they may be, that will be the standard by which they seek to comply. Same with the state of California, if you did business there.
And what are the various risks posed to government agencies?
Well, I mean, I think it depends, right? The only thing I will say for government agencies is, in many ways, depending on, they do have access to, oftentimes, to a broader range of information. It can be more sensitive. The consequence can arguably, you could say, be more, broadly impactful, depending on whether it's sort of, defense related or energy related. But even you think about some of the breaches that you had with OPM, our Office of Personnel Management, where just tons of information, tons of personal information about, personal information was breached. It's just they're huge data sources, right? They're these huge data pools. And it's perhaps not even just one breach that ultimately can manifest, in terms of what the real harm could ultimately be. So I do think that there's that aspect that makes that kind of vulnerability potentially more impactful. I think the other is, these are public institutions. So, when you think about these are the, government actually having those vulnerabilities, and they're in charge of actually making sure oftentimes that, the private sector is adopting sufficient cybersecurity protections. It undermines confidence, I think, in their credibility, and I think that's also a loss. So it's important, I think, for government, aside from the more specific harm that can come from particular breaches, is that credibility gap that's created by virtue of their own vulnerabilities.
And why do you find Sepio's system solution relevant for today's challenges?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning, I think one of the great things about what Sepio offers is the visibility. And when I think about, as a board member, as I think about trying to understand what a particular organization's cyber risk is, I want to have a clear view as much as possible across our enterprise about our assets and devices. And so having that foundational understanding and having confidence that we're able to actively monitor it and identify potential rogue devices would be hugely beneficial. So I think that capability, and I view it really very much as sort of like, sort of good housekeeping 101, is being able to have that kind of visibility. That's something that as a board member, I would really value.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me and talk and answer my questions. And it was great to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessie. It's a pleasure as well.